8:52 p.m., July 11th, 2015, Altiplano, Mexico. A man vanished from the most secure prison on earth, through the floor. This wasn't just any prisoner. This was Joaquin Guzman El Chapo, the most watched inmate in the Western Hemisphere. He was locked in a cell designed specifically to hold him. Cameras everywhere, a GPS tracker strapped to his ankle, guards monitoring 24/7. The prison was a fortress of reinforced concrete and steel that had never been breached. He stood up from his bed, walked to the shower, the only blind spot in the entire cell, and 40 minutes later, when the guards checked, he was gone. How do you escape a facility designed to be inescapable? Under the nose of an entire government? To understand how a man vanishes into thin air, we have to understand the man himself. Because for El Chapo, prison wasn't a cage. It was just an office with bad lighting. This story doesn't begin in the tunnel of 2015. It begins 14 years earlier, with a laundry cart. It was January 19th, 2001, Puente Grande Prison. At the time, this was considered the most fortified facility in Mexico. 2 guards for every single inmate. Watchtowers manned by snipers. Checkpoints that resembled military border crossings. It was designed to hold the leaders of private armies, the men who ran the drug trade with iron fists, and El Chapo was right in the middle of it. But he wasn't suffering. While other prisoners followed strict schedules, El Chapo was living a life that most free men would envy. He had turned the maximum security prison into his own personal hotel. He had cell phones, he had alcohol, he ordered whatever food he wanted. He even had women brought in his wives, his mistresses staying for days at a time inside the cell block. He wasn't just an inmate, he was the landlord. He had bribed everyone, from the lowest janitor to the highest officials. The man who made this possible was Damaso Lopez, the deputy chief of security. This is the man who should have been keeping El Chapo in. Instead, he was on El Chapo's payroll, receiving houses, cars, and millions of dollars to look the other way. They weren't guard and prisoner, they were business partners. But then, the wind changed. In early 2001, news reached the prison that the Mexican Supreme Court was considering a new law, extradition. They were going to start sending drug lords to the United States. El Chapo knew what that meant. In Mexico, he could buy comfort. In the United States, in a sterile supermax cell. His money meant nothing. He had to go. He didn't dig a tunnel that time. He used something much simpler. He found a laundry worker named Chito, a man nobody noticed. A man who pushed a cart full of dirty sheets back and forth every day. On the morning of January 19th, El Chapo climbed into the cart. Chito piled dirty laundry on top of him. Sheets, uniforms, towels. The smell was awful, but the cover was perfect. Chito began to push. He rolled the cart through the corridors, past the cells, toward the exit. But then came the moment that almost ended it all. They reached a gate. A guard was standing there. Chito stopped to talk, to get the gate opened, but he let go of the cart for a second. The cart, top heavy with the weight of a grown man, started to roll backward. It began to tip. Inside, El Chapo must have held his breath, bracing for the impact that would spill him onto the concrete floor at the feet of the guards. At the last second, Chito grabbed the handle. He steadied the cart. He laughed it off with the guard. The gate opened, and he pushed it through. They reached the parking lot. El Chapo climbed out of the laundry, hopped into the trunk of a waiting car driven by a bribed guard, and drove out the front gate. Just like that. The most dangerous man in Mexico was a ghost. For the next 14 years, he didn't just hide, he expanded. From the mountains of Sinaloa, he built an empire that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. He was moving billions of dollars of cocaine into the US. He was hiring engineers, architects, and geologists. Why? Because he had discovered that the best way to move product wasn't over the border. It was under it. He revolutionized the drug trade with tunnels, His team became the best excavators in the world. They built tunnels with lighting, with ventilation, with rail systems. They were moving $20 million of product a month. While the police searched for him, he was becoming the most powerful drug lord in history, surpassing even Pablo Escobar. He was a legend. He was untouchable, or so he thought. But technology catches up to everyone. By February 2014, the Mexican Marines, working with US intelligence, had changed their strategy. They stopped looking for El Chapo and started tracking the people around him. His chefs, his assistants, his family. They cracked his encrypted communication network. They pinpointed his location to a safe house in Culiacan. On February 17th, 2014, the Marines hit the house. They had a battering ram. They hit the front door. It didn't budge. It was reinforced steel, filled with water to distribute the heat of cutting torches. It took them 10 minutes to break it down. 10 minutes is a lifetime when you're running. By the time they stormed the bedroom, it was empty. The coffee was still hot. The bed was still warm. But El Chapo was gone. He hadn't run out the back door. He had gone into the bathroom. He had pressed a hidden switch behind the mirror, which activated a hydraulic system that lifted the bathtub. Under the tub was a staircase leading into the city's sewer system. He had escaped underground again. But this time, he made a mistake. He didn't flee to the mountains. He went to a resort town, Mazatlan, to meet his wife and twin daughters. He thought he was safe. He thought he had lost them. But the trace on his phone was still active. 5 days later, at the Hotel Miramar, Marines silently surrounded room 401. They smashed the door. There was no tunnel this time, no laundry cart, just a man in his underwear, looking shocked, realizing that for the first time in 13 years, the game was paused. They weren't going to make the same mistake twice. They didn't send him back to Puente Grande. They sent him to Altiplano. Altiplano Federal Prison is a beast. It sits on a high plateau, isolated from everything. It looks less like a prison and more like a nuclear bunker. The walls are reinforced concrete, a full meter thick, designed to withstand rocket-propelled grenades. The airspace above it is a strict no-fly zone to prevent helicopter extractions. There are rumors of anti-aircraft weapons on the roof. Inside, it's a labyrinth. Doors are controlled electronically from a central command center. Communication is jammed. Cell phones don't work there. The guards are vetted, rotated, and watched by other guards. The corruption that rotted Puente Grande wasn't supposed to exist here. El Chapo was placed in the special treatments area, solitary confinement for the most dangerous men in the country. His world shrank to a few square meters. A concrete bed, a concrete shelf, a toilet, and a shower area protected by a small privacy wall. He was allowed out for 1 hour a day. For 23 hours, he was alone. A camera watched him every second. There were no blind spots, except one. The privacy wall for the shower was just high enough to block the camera's view of the prisoner's lower body while bathing. It was a tiny square of privacy, maybe 18 inches by 18 inches. A humane gesture in an inhumane place. And that tiny square was all he needed. How do you break out of a prison that is buried in concrete? You don't go through the walls. You don't go over the fence. You go down. But you can't dig a tunnel from the inside. You have nothing to dig with. And nowhere to put the dirt. The tunnel has to come to you. But think about the math of this. Someone on the outside has to dig a tunnel more than a mile long, underground, and have it pop up exactly to the inch in a specific shower stall, in a specific cell, in a massive prison complex. If they are off by 3 feet, they hit the foundation wall. If they are off by 10 feet, they pop up in the hallway. It had to be perfect. El Chapo's team went to work immediately. They found a piece of property about 5 kilometers away from the prison walls. It was an unfinished cinder block house in the middle of a field. It looked abandoned, perfect cover. They bought it in the name of a ghost, someone who didn't exist. And then, the digging began. This wasn't two guys with shovels. This was an industrial engineering project. They brought in mining equipment. They hired certified engineers who had likely been trained in building subways or drainage systems. They had to be quiet. They had to be invisible. They worked for months. They removed tons of dirt, likely spreading it across the surrounding farmland at night so no one would notice the growing piles. They installed a ventilation system with PVC piping to pump fresh air a mile underground. They wired the tunnel with electricity for lighting. They built a rail system, a literal train track bolted to the floor of the tunnel. But the biggest problem remained: navigation. How do you guide a drill bit through a mile of earth to hit a target the size of a manhole cover? El Chapo had an ace up his sleeve, or rather, on his wrist. He was allowed to see two people, his lawyer and his wife, Emma Coronel. Through coded messages, he coordinated the plan, but he needed to give them his exact coordinates. He managed to compromise the uncompromisable prison. He had a GPS device smuggled in. It came in a watch, a simple, digital watch, or so the guards thought. He wore it inside the cell. He wore it in the shower. That device was transmitting his exact coordinates to the engineers underground. They weren't guessing. They were following a beacon. The digging went on for months, under the cornfields, under the perimeter fence, under the patrol roads, under the reinforced concrete foundation of the prison itself. The noise must have been audible. But remember, Altiplano was undergoing maintenance to the water system at the time. Construction noise was everywhere. It was the perfect camouflage. By July 2015, they were close. The tension in the tunnel must have been suffocating. They were drilling upward now. They had to break through the floor of the cell without alerting the guards who were patrolling the hallway just a few feet away. They had to be silent. They had to be precise. July 11th, 2015, 8 p.m. In his cell, El Chapo sat on his bed. He was wearing his prison uniform. He put on his shoes. He turned up the volume on his small television. A comedy show was playing. The noise of the laughter and the dialogue filled the small concrete box. It was loud, loud enough to cover the sound of a drill grinding against the concrete beneath the shower. 8:50 p.m. The guards in the command center were watching the screens. They saw the prisoner pacing. This was normal. He was restless. He walked from the bed to the toilet, from the toilet to the shower. He paused at the shower. He looked down. On the screen, nothing looked wrong. He crouched down behind the privacy wall. This was normal behavior. Prisoners wash. Prisoners use the toilet. The guards watched the screen, bored, waiting for him to stand up. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. 10 minutes. On the screen, the cell was empty. But the guards didn't panic yet. Maybe he was washing clothes. Maybe he was sitting on the floor. But down in the shower, the impossible had happened. A square of concrete, perfectly cut, had dropped away. Beneath it was a hole, a vertical shaft leading down 30 feet. El Chapo didn't hesitate. He slipped into the hole. He climbed down a ladder. At the bottom, the air was cool and damp. He wasn't in a dirt crawl space. He was in a tunnel that was 5 feet high. He could stand up, and waiting for him was the ultimate escape vehicle. It was a motorcycle, but not just a motorcycle. It had been modified. It was mounted on the rails. Its engine was tuned to run in the confined space. A driver was waiting for him. El Chapo straddled the bike. The engine revved, and they shot off into the darkness. Imagine that ride. A mile-long tunnel, lit by a string of bulbs, rushing past at 40 miles per hour. The wind in his face, the realization that he had done it again. He had beaten the system. He had beaten the government. He was flying underneath the fences, underneath the towers, underneath the snipers. The ride took minutes. They reached the end of the line, the unfinished house in the cornfield. He climbed up the ladder. He stepped out into the cool night air of the Mexican countryside. He was free. Back in the prison, the silence stretched on. 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Finally, a guard was sent to check. He walked down the hallway. He looked through the bars. Guzman? Silence. Guzman! The guard unlocked the door. He walked in. He checked the bed. Empty. He walked to the shower wall. He looked over the edge, and his stomach must have dropped through the floor. The hole was staring back at him. A black abyss leading straight to hell. By the time the sirens wailed, by the time the lockdown was initiated, El Chapo was miles away. He had been driven to an airstrip. A pilot, one of his most trusted men, was waiting with a plane. They took off into the night. They flew to Querétaro, then transferred to another plane, finally landing deep in the mountains of the Golden Triangle, Sinaloa, his home turf. The embarrassment for the government was total. The president of Mexico was on a state visit to France when the news broke. He had to face the world press and explain how the most dangerous man on earth had walked out of his supermax prison. It was a humiliation that stung. But for El Chapo, it was a victory lap. He was back in his mountains. He was back in charge. But he had changed. The isolation of Altiplano had affected him. He was paranoid, but he was also arrogant. He thought he was invincible. He started reaching out to Hollywood producers. He wanted a movie made about his life. He wanted to tell his story. This vanity would be his undoing. The manhunt that followed was unlike anything in history. The Mexican Marines were humiliated, and they were angry. They weren't just looking for a criminal. They were looking to restore their honor. They flooded Sinaloa. They had Black Hawk helicopters, satellite imagery, and American listening technology. 6 months later, January 2016, the Marines picked up a signal. It was in the coastal city of Los Mochis. They were monitoring phone chatter. They kept hearing a code name, Grandma. Grandma is coming. Get the room ready for Grandma. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Grandma wasn't an elderly woman. It was the boss. They tracked the location to a large, white house in a residential neighborhood. They watched. They waited. They saw a car arrive. They saw heavy security. On January 8th, 2016, at 4:30 inches the morning, the Marines made their move. This wasn't a knock on the door. This was a siege. They breached the front gate. Gunfire erupted immediately. El Chapo's bodyguards were ready. They were armed with .50 caliber sniper rifles, rocket launchers, and machine guns. The house turned into a war zone. Bullets tore through the walls. The Marines advanced room by room, under heavy fire. In the chaos, amidst the smoke and the screaming, El Chapo did what he always did. He went to the bedroom. He went to the mirror. He opened the secret door. He and his chief assassin, a man named Cholo Ivan, slipped into the tunnel. They were crawling through the municipal sewer system now. Above them, the Marines were clearing the house, finding only dead bodyguards and empty rooms. Grandma was gone again. El Chapo and Cholo crawled for a mile through the filth. They popped up through a manhole cover in the middle of a street, blocks away from the raid. They were soaked, dirty, and desperate. They didn't have a convoy this time. They didn't have a plan. They saw a car approaching. They flagged it down. They hijacked it at gunpoint. El Chapo was behind the wheel. He was driving for his life. He just needed to get out of the city, get to the mountains, get to safety. But then, the flashing lights appeared behind him. It wasn't the Marines. It wasn't the Special Forces. It was just two Federal Highway Patrol officers. They had spotted the stolen car. They pulled it over. Imagine the scene. Two regular cops walk up to the window, and looking back at them is the most wanted man in the world. El Chapo didn't panic. He played his strongest card. He offered them money, not just a little money. He offered them companies. He offered them a life of luxury. You will never have to work again. He told them, just let us go. This is the moment where history holds its breath. In Mexico, the phrase plata o plomo, silver or lead, is the law of the land. You take the bribe, or you take the bullet. These officers knew who he was. They knew that if they arrested him, the cartel would hunt them down. They knew that if they let him go, they would be rich. But these two officers did something incredible. They said no. They handcuffed the drug lord. But then, the radio crackled. The cartel was coming. El Chapo's rescue teams were intercepting the police radio frequencies. They knew where he was. The officers realized they couldn't make it to the police station. They would be ambushed on the road. So they improvised. They drove the squad car to a cheap roadside sex motel, the Hotel Du. They dragged El Chapo into one of the rooms. They called for backup, and they waited. El Chapo sat on the bed, still trying to negotiate. "My men are coming," he said. "You're going to die here." The officers aimed their rifles at the door. They waited. They heard engines roaring outside, tires screeching on gravel. This was it. The cartel was here. El Chapo smirked. He looked at the officers. "I told you," he said. "You should have taken the money." But when the door burst open, it wasn't the cartel. It was the Mexican Marines. The look on El Chapo's face was captured in a photograph that went viral minutes later. He is sitting on the edge of a dirty motel bed, wearing a filthy undershirt. His hands handcuffed. He looks defeated. He looks small. The myth of invincibility was broken. This time, Mexico didn't take any chances. They didn't want him in their prisons. They didn't want the headache. The extradition that he had feared for 15 years was finally happening. On January 19th, 2017, almost exactly 16 years after his first escape in the laundry cart, Joaquin Guzman was marched across the tarmac at an airport in Ciudad Juarez. He was put on a plane. He was still asking where he was going. He thought maybe he was being moved to another Mexican prison. But when the plane landed, he looked out the window. He saw the skyline of New York. And for the first time, witnesses say they saw tears in his eyes. He knew it was over. The trial was a spectacle, but the outcome was never in doubt. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. But where do you put a man who can escape from anything? A man who treats maximum security prisons like hotels? You put him in a place that isn't a prison. You put him in a tomb. They sent him to ADX Florence in Colorado, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. This is the only supermax prison in the United States federal system. It is designed for the worst of the worst: terrorists, spies, gang leaders. In ADX, there are no laundry carts. There are no blind spots in the showers. The cells are made of poured concrete. The furniture is immovable concrete. The window is a 4-inch slit looking at the sky, so you can't even tell where you are in the complex. The walls are soundproof. You don't see other prisoners. You don't hear them. You spend 23 hours a day in a room the size of a parking space. There are no tunnels here. The prison is built on solid rock. There are 12-foot fences with razor wire, pressure pads in the ground, and attack dogs. And even if you got out of the cell, and out of the building, and over the fence, you are in the middle of the high desert. There is nothing for miles. El Chapo is there right now. As you listen to this, he is sitting in that concrete box. He will be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until he dies. The man who spent $1 billion to build tunnels, who bought governments, who defied the laws of physics and engineering, was finally defeated by something very simple: 4 honest cops on a highway, and a concrete room in Colorado. He escaped the inescapable twice, but everyone has a limit, and Joaquin Guzman finally found his. This was the story of the world's greatest escape artist, but even Houdini couldn't get out of this box. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story of brilliance and justice, hit that like button and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.